great pleasure to welcome you to this panel. This is the second of two panels on paradigm shifts or paradigm maintenance in international development. We have four fantastic looking presentations here. So we're going to begin with Laura Mann and Tin Hinane El-Kadi at the LSE, who are going to be presenting on convergence or divergence, control over knowledge and technology in contemporary global economy. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes. I will give you I don't know whether you're going to be able to see me, but I will give you a 5-minute warning visually, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning by like butting in and just saying 2 minutes, if that's okay. So yeah, please start now.
Okay, so this is a paper. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us. This is a collaboration between Tin and I. Tin and I have kind of worked on two different projects together. The first is a podcast about knowledge production, and then we've also done a lot of research together about digital technologies and the knowledge economy. And her PhD is specifically about China in North Africa. So the paper has a case study about China. And so the paper is really an attempt to kind of put together sort of discussions within knowledge production with looking at kind of the role of knowledge within the global economy. And we start our paper with this fable about blind men and the elephant, which I'm sure everybody knows. It's this idea that every man puts his hands on a different part of the elephant, and they come away with very different ideas about what the elephant looks like. At the end of the story, they conclude that only together they can know the truth. We think that this is a good metaphor for capturing the problematic ways that development studies has tried to decolonize itself. First of all the men have the same positionality and power. There is no hierarchy between them. Second, the disagreement between them is just a matter of component parts. There's no kind of disagreements, merely their parts have to be scaffolded next to each other. And finally, the elephant is a kind of wild natural beast, not something that has been trained to behave in certain ways. So when it comes to the role of knowledge within development, none of these conditions are true. Each scholar is not isolated and doesn't come with the same resources of power or positionality. Rather, there is a hierarchy in terms of the authority to produce theory, and then a sort of inverse relationship to the positionality of people involved. So there is a kind of an aptness to this metaphor, but the wrong moral is being drawn. It's not about sort of having more perspectives, but it's specifically looking at the kind of hierarchical relationship between the scholars involved, between these blind men and the other villagers who are absent from the story. So in this paper, and the second thing is that the object of analysis, the elephant, isn't this natural thing, but it's something that scholarship and practice has actively constituted, performed, and kind of constantly validated and reinforced through those knowledge hierarchies. So while we can think about there being kind of physical material infrastructures of kind of knowledge within capitalism, there's also this kind of parallel knowledge hierarchy around kind of theoretical performativity. So the project of development as driven by high-income countries has always suffered from this tendency to impose theoretical conclusions gleaned from their own contexts onto others. So in this paper, we want to bring attention to the ways in which this kind of abstraction and this collapsing of scale has been used to naturalize the experiences of European and other kind of white settler economies' experience of capitalism as being universal, abstract processes, which are then kind of applied at this individual country level. And we're looking at this particularly in relation to kind of current attempts to understand digital technologies. So we're responding to kind of two sets of literature, and I'm going to go quickly here because I want Tin to have time to speak. So the first is the kind of global development and this idea of converging development, which is presented in a kind of positive light within development studies in terms of the rise of the BRICS and this idea that we can move away from binaries of developed and developing and North and South. But obviously, as many others have pointed out, once you start to disaggregate between countries and you specifically remove China from the picture, this kind of global inequality abstraction completely collapses. So China is a specific case, and that's one reason why we focus on it. But in the paper, we tried to kind of link this kind of current abstraction to kind of a longer history of the kind of problematic abstractions and collapsing of scale that's been true of development throughout its history. And this quote by Timothy Mitchell does a kind of nice job of kind of summarizing how on the one side, there's this kind of abstraction and this idea of universal capitalist forces, usually gleaned from the experiences of European capitalism, but then kind of locked into the kind of nation state. So instead of kind of thinking about hierarchies and structures, we kind of get instead to comparisons, cross-country comparisons, and to this theory of catch-up, rather than looking at kind of the kind of colonial hierarchies. And then the second literature that the paper is responding to is kind of more or less coming from the same idea about converging divergence, but it's theorizing very much from the perspective of high-income countries, where they are more concerned about the divergence part than about the kind of global convergence. And in particular, they're kind of worried about this kind of divergence between productivity and wage growth. And they kind of explain it in terms of assetization and rentierism, the idea that there's kind of increasing intellectual property regimes around the world, and this is creating assets, and this is what is going wrong with capitalism. But I would argue that this kind of theorization is trying to kind of treat the past as this good framework for analyzing the future. And it's kind of theorizing, therefore, of a very kind of rosy past, but for a very select part of the world. So I think that there are problems with the way that this literature is kind of understanding contemporary capitalism. The other main problem with this kind of literature is that even if global divergence was true, the cumulative effects of that kind of history of divergence, that period of colonial divergence, is it's left a number of leftovers. So both kind of material, structural leftovers, but also kind of the conceptual performative. So material-wise, you know, fully formalized labor markets, tax bases, investments in knowledge infrastructures, control over the global financial system, monetary sovereignty, all of these kinds of features that are very peculiar to high-income countries, but have kind of become the normalized ideas about capitalism. But some of these leftovers are, we can think of in terms of physical assets, in terms of the hierarchy of knowledge around kind of commercialization of science and innovation. But there's also this hierarchy of knowledge in terms of theorizing about capitalism and trying to glean from the experience of their economies and impose it onto others. And indeed, if we look at those kind of books in the last slides, the kind of solutions to the current crisis of capitalism today, many of them are kind of drawing on resources that aren't available for the majority of the world. So things like basic income grants or the use of modern monetary theory. You know, if you don't have monetary sovereignty, you can't do those things, okay? And in the case of Milanovic's book, he talks about segmented citizenship, which is obviously very transparently colonial. The other thing that is problematic about converging divergence is if you're moving away from binaries of developed and developing, north and south, you're also moving away from the colonial history that created global divergence, and therefore moving away from any kind of discussion of historical responsibilities for different inheritances and debts and damages that were done during that period of divergence. So we cannot transcend capitalism in one place without taking account of what our own historical arc in high-income countries did to other parts of the world, both in a material sense, but also in this ongoing performative sense in which the rules of the game are being understood and conceptualized from the perspective of high-income countries. So in this paper, we're kind of focusing on the kind of performative aspects of this problem. So on the one hand, we kind of have these physical infrastructures and material infrastructures in terms of the knowledge economy, but there's also this other kind of performative infrastructure about trying to theorize from the perspective of high-income countries in response to this kind of these changes within the knowledge economy. So from the perspective of high-income countries, the kind of norms that they're building their theories on is this expectation of a fully formalized labor market as being a kind of normal phenomena of capitalism, and then a reliance on all these kinds of old, the reliance on the past is providing a good guide to the future. So this kind of puzzling of like, why doesn't competition policy work anymore? Competition as this abstract force has always been our guide. Why doesn't it work anymore? Or this idea of this kind of naturalized relationship between productivity and wage growth as being a guide. Why doesn't it work anymore? And also this kind of abstraction around technology's role in development. So thinking about aggregate total factor productivity, thinking about sort of human capital in the abstract, and thinking, oh, if we just invest in more education, we're going to become more knowledge intensive. And then this kind of continuation of trying to impose on other countries this idea that development should be measured and understood at the national level. Unfortunately, for the majority of the world, the idea of a kind of normalized labor market, formalized labor market, and all of these norms that have been gleaned from the historical experiences of high-income countries have never provided much help and guidance in terms of understanding development. So now we're going to shift gears, and Tin is going to be talking about her wider project on China. And in this paper, she's been exploring policy documents to show how China's rise is linked specifically to its subversion of this kind of abstraction and collapsing of the scales that's so problematic within mainstream development theory.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. Thanks. I'm going to try and be succinct and quick. So yeah, China is often the emblematic case of converging divergence. So the Chinese story has actually, in a way, allowed to reinforce this narrative about convergence. But when we look more closely at the Chinese case, we find all sorts of evidence that actually Chinese policymakers are thinking about development in a different way. And there are important implications for the relationship between like technology and growth. So in place of abstractions actually about technology, we find that China adopts a deliberate, experimental, and relational strategy. So first of all, by deliberate, we mean that the Chinese very much understands that, unlike predicted by the neoclassical theory, that there is nothing natural about, capital going to one place, but it was actually a set of policies adopted to try and make China one of the most popular destinations of capital across the world. And some of these policies included preferential tax regimes for FDI, but also lowering tariffs for key components. It was very much an experimental process as well, as described in the work of Albert Hirschman. So China's approach to development can be described as very gradual and measured. And one of the best examples of this is in China's special economic zones. So as you probably all know, China started by opening up to market forces in some cities, most notably Shenzhen and Xiamen. And then it started expanding to other places after the success of the first special economic zones. So it wasn't, theories like off-the-shelf big theories, but very much experimentation and adjustment. Also, the Chinese understand very well the need to manipulate competition and not leave it to just market forces. There were a lot of interventionist measures set to regulate competition. And there was no assumption between the relationship between productivity and wage employment. There was, for instance, for many years, the Chinese government actually suppressed wage growth in order to keep its competitive advantage in low labor, like cheap labor. There's also what we see in recent documents, especially since the US trade war with China, a lot of scrutiny about the implications of different technologies and a deep understanding of both the strategic and economic value of technology.
Sorry to interrupt, just if you could wrap up quite soon, a couple of minutes.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I will be quick. Okay, and China also has this relational view, when it means that like it considers its development strategy both relative to richer countries, but also poorer countries. And this is quite interesting about the Chinese case. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. I'm going to try and be very quick. So the abstraction and universalization in the convergence narrative has actually obscured the peculiar ways in which China understands the role of knowledge in development. And we argue that China's deliberate experimental and relational approach allowed it to understand early on the value of knowledge production in terms of control of innovation, but also control over theoretical understandings of development. And this has helped it to break out the global hierarchy. So while it looks like it's convergence according to some abstract processes that were theorized elsewhere, it's really about rejecting those abstract processes. Just moving on very quickly to the, so here we talk in the paper in more details about how by the early 2000s, China realized that its export-led model had generated a low-wage assembly regime with high dependence on foreign technology. And there was a purposeful shift towards indigenous innovation. And China started investing heavily in research and development and made some remarkable progress in this sense. So for instance, research and development increased more than 20 times between 2000 and 2019. And the number of patents from China increased more than 100 times. And so, but beyond this, like increasing research and development and so on, starting from the 2000s, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, there was an increasing scrutiny of new technological trends. And we can see this very clearly in the 13th five-year plan, but also in the most recent 14th five-year plan, which really sets the tone and kind of puts the objective of technological independence as a very high priority. Last slide. So we look in the paper at how China values data and the case of Chinese platforms. So unlike what was described in conventional wisdom, that China's protectionist digital policies like the Great Firewall would stifle innovation, actually did the opposite. It allowed the emergence of big tech giants such as Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, so the famous BATs. And China has a very, from what we saw from policy documents consulted for this paper, a deep understanding of both the economic and strategic value of data. I will just conclude because I know we're over time, so I'm skipping some of the points. So yeah, we're saying as a conclusion that the global convergence narrative creates problematic abstractions that obscure critical questions around hierarchy, history, and power. And the argument on global convergence does not actually hold once we take China out of the picture. Once China is included, the abstraction and universalization narrative of its rise is also challenged, as China has precisely succeeded by not following the same assumptions about development gleaned from old, out-of-date rules of technology and growth. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. I'm sure there'll be lots of good resonances with later presentations. So I think let's move straight on through. It's now Tadashi. We're going to go to you, Tadashi Hirai from the University of Cambridge. And again, I'll try and signal a 5 minutes in the chat and with my hands, and I'll give you 2 minutes on the mic.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you very much. In this presentation, can you see the slide? Okay, great. In this presentation, I'd like to demonstrate a delicate balancing act between the mainstream and alternative views in the field of development by exploring both the explicit and implicit power of the mainstream in the past and present alternatives. For this purpose, I'll focus on two development goals, which are MDGs and SDGs, as well as two development approaches, which are basic needs and human development. Here is the outline. First, the gap between ideal and reality in the SDG will be reviewed. Second, I will demonstrate the necessity of the growth perspective, namely the mainstream view, even in the alternatives, and then reveal some cases in which the growth perspective erodes the alternatives. So the second part is about an explicit power of the mainstream, and the third part is about an implicit power of the mainstream. Finally, I will propose the future direction of the alternatives. SDGs have 17 goals, which are typically categorized into economic, social, and environmental dimensions. While each goal in MDGs was regarded as a separate silo, SDGs are regarded as a nested concept. But it is based on the fundamental assumption all SDGs are achievable without competing with each other. This figure shows the synergies and trade-offs among the SDGs. Trade-offs are highlighted in orange here. Clearly, some goals, particularly those associated with economic growth, such as Goal 8, 9, and 12, have a substantial number of trade-offs with other goals. This corresponds to two types of sustainability. Weak sustainability allows both synergy and trade-offs, as illustrated in the left-hand side, whereas strong sustainability allows synergies only, as in the right-hand side. Between the two, SDGs follow weak sustainability. But now, what is the reasoning behind this selection as an alternative approach? In other words, why does economic side of development remain as a major part in the SDGs? This indeed represents a delicate balancing act between the mainstream and the alternatives, which is fortified by the historical evidence that follows. In this section, I would like to show two cases of historical evidence representing the necessity of the growth perspective in the alternatives for their survivals. First, unlike the MDGs, SDGs were created through a series of consultation process with wide participation from different groups. For example, not only developed, but also developing nations, not only public, but also private sectors, not only elites and technocrats, but also civil society in general, and not only economists, but also specialists from a wide range of disciplines. Such an open consultation allowed environmental issues to be pushed to the forefront. But this also allowed the growth perspective to be included. As a result, unlike the MDGs, focusing on poverty reduction, SDGs have got attention from those who have power in favor of the mainstream view. Indeed, SDGs have been taken seriously in the business sector. This gives us a tentative assumption. Economic growth is essential for the alternatives to remain influential or to be sustainable, paradoxically. Now, let's look at another and even clearer historical evidence. Human development focuses on well-being in itself rather than the means of it. Nonetheless, HDI, which is a composite index of human development, includes not only life expectancy and educational attainment, which are regarded as well-being in themselves, but also income, which is a typical means of well-being. This contrasts with the PQLI, which is a composite index of basic needs. Although basic needs was conceptually very similar to human development by focusing on well-being, PQLI followed the concept faithfully and did not include income as an indicator. Indeed, the inclusion of income as one of the three dimensions is a unique feature of the HDI in comparison with the past indices, which either excluded income completely, such as the case of PQLI, or it included income, but as one of many indicators, making the impact of income insignificant. All these indices were short-lived, unlike the HDI, which has survived over the past 3 decades. This shows another evidence that economic growth is essential for the alternatives to remain influential. The analysis I made so far is about an explicit power of the mainstream. Next, let's move on to an implicit power of the mainstream in the alternatives. As we will see, the alternatives are at risk of being eroded by the mainstream. Starting with the SDGs, this can be represented by the employment of weak sustainability. In this context, despite the recent progress in quantifiability and data update, as shown in this graph, particularly in environmental dimension, it is important not to be disguised by these superficial trends, checking them a little deeper as possible erosion of the growth perspective emerges. First, stagnant progress in data update in economic dimension is largely due to their combination with environmental and social dimensions, which are of course not directly relevant to growth. For example, material footprint per GDP, proportion and number of children engaged in child labor, and growth rates of household expenditure or income per capita among the bottom 40% of the population, and many, many more. As a result, indicators relevant to growth tend to be prioritized because they are frequently updated and thus can be used for monitoring purposes. When this tendency is combined with the empirical evidence which I presented earlier about economic goals having a substantial trade-offs with other goals, it would be inevitable to understate the non-economic goals. In fact, the SDG index created by Bertelsmann Stiftung and Sustainable Development Solutions Network ranks countries with high ecological footprint as high achievers in the overall SDGs. Second, and more importantly, quantifiability of the existing indicators has to be distinguished from actual sustainability, precisely because the existing SDGs do not follow the planetary boundaries concept. Indeed, most environmental indicators simply measure either the number, amount, level, proportion, or change of incidence. For example, change in water use efficiency over time, degree of integrated water resources management, and total greenhouse gas emission per year, and many, many more. As a matter of fact, the avoidance of planetary boundaries concept seems intertwined with the protection of vested interests of the powerful. And this leads to the necessity of a cautiously optimistic view, as advocated by Johan Rockström and Jeffrey Sachs. Quote, within the planetary boundaries, through the deployment of the new sustainable technologies and new global rules of the game, unquote, even though such technologies and rules are neither currently available nor guaranteed to be available anytime soon. It is important to note here that Rockström is the very person who proposed the planetary boundaries concept in 2009. This shows us two unrealistic choices. On the one hand, it is unrealistic to be optimistic for unbooked technologies and systems. On the other hand, it is equally unrealistic to maintain the impact of the SDGs by ignoring the growth perspective, namely the voice of vested interests. Scaling between the two, the first choice has been selected for political feasibility. If the second choice was selected, SDGs would lose impetus, which would in turn accelerate the growth paradigm even further. Another evidence of eroding the alternatives by the mainstream can be found in the income treatment in the HDI. Unlike health and educational indicators, which are well-being in themselves and transformed linearly, income is the means of well-being and so transformed based on the principle of diminishing returns, so that discount can be applied according to the level of progress. As you can see in this table, the maximum value here used for income transformation have shifted on an upward trend in a drastic manner over time. It seems not coincidental that the hike in 2010 occurred when the Human Development Report was led by an economist from the World Bank. To illustrate, this is a shift in US ranking of the HDI. As we can see, the timing of revision largely corresponds to the improvement of the US ranking. In addition, a recent decline indicates the necessity of further revision. Otherwise, human development will be another alternative approach destined to disappear. In fact, this could be already happening given the recent influence of the SDGs.
2 minutes, please, Tadashi.
Yeah, to conclude, the alternatives require the mainstream to get involved for their influences and survivals. Human development and the SDGs have succeeded in this respect. So, for the alternatives to be influential, they need to be not only ideologically powerful enough to compete with the mainstream, but also politically flexible enough to get attention from the mainstream. At the same time, the development discourse is evolving. Indeed, sustainability was one of the central issues when human development was introduced in 1990, but not included in the HDI because it was not ready to get attention from the mainstream. It is only through a global consultation process for the creation of the SDGs that sustainability have got attention from the mainstream. This historical fact gives us a lesson. Negotiation between the mainstream and the alternatives ought to remain active, even if the mainstream tends to override the alternatives. This would be the only way that the alternatives remain influential enough to compete with the mainstream, if not a reversal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tadashi, and for delivering on time. That's great, really interesting. We'll again move on. Please, everyone, note down any questions you have, and we can take them all together at the end. So next up, we have, I believe, Tobias Wuttke. I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing everybody's names wrong. Who will be talking about global value chain-led industrialization. I will give you a 5-minute warning visually and then warn you at 2 minutes. So you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yeah,
perfect.
Very clear.
So yes, thanks for the introduction. So yeah, my name is Tobias Wuttke. I think you did well with the name. Everything is fine. So I'm a PhD student at Roskilde University in Denmark, and I have started my PhD in 2019. So I'm now in my second year. Let me just close the window because they're cutting some grass. So I'm now in my second year and I'm due to submit the thesis next year, towards the end of next year. And what I'm talking about today is basically the theoretical framework of my thesis. So I'm doing my PhD on the South African automotive industry and how they have integrated the industry with the global production network since the end of apartheid in the mid-1990s. And I'm trying to investigate the linkages to the rest of the domestic economy, the capabilities of the local component manufacturers, and what kind of industrial policy there was and what effect it had. So linkages are the topic that I want to emphasize in this presentation, because what I want to argue is that there needs to be more emphasis on that. I mean, there is emphasis on that topic, but I think especially in the mainstream GVC literature that is taken up by publications from the international organizations, there's too little emphasis on the topic. So there is a literature already engaging with whether the application of the GVC framework by international organizations, whether that means paradigm shift or paradigm maintenance. There's this paper in 2014 by Werner, Baer, and Fernandez, where they just analyze how the GVC approach is actually taken up by many different institutions. There's a very critical take by Nelson, 2013, who argues that it's just used in such a selective way to not lead to any paradigm shift. Giraffi is a bit, as the father of the concept, basically is a bit more positive, that it can lead to a post-Washington consensus. And then there are more recently very critical takes of the recent World Development Report 2020, which was actually about global value chains completely. And there's this piece by Selvin and Leiden, which argues that it doesn't deal with social upgrading in any reasonable way. My focus here is more on catch-up industrialization. And I would argue that even there are some weaknesses with respect to ignoring the importance of backward integration. So what I will do is I will look at what the World Development Report has to say about that topic. Then I would want to argue why I think it's relevant to re-emphasize domestic linkages again, based on theory and the East Asian experience. And then I want to engage with the state-of-the-art literature that actually deals with this question currently, and talk a little bit about the case study of my PhD. So in the World Development Report, the basic argument is, and I was actually reminded when you spoke, Laura, about Branko Milanovic's book, because there's the same take in there, that GVCs are actually good for developing countries, because they don't have to build up vertically integrated industries anymore. They can just link up to supply chains, and that's a positive thing. And so there's no need to master the entire production process anymore. Domestic firms can engage with foreign firms, which leads to know-how and technology sharing, and participating in GVCs means productivity increases. And they then also conclude that this structure of global production means that the old policies, the ISI policies, local content requirements, subsidies, vertical incentives, they don't work anymore in this kind of world, and countries should abstain from them. There is some acknowledgement towards the end that just linking up to global value chains is not enough, and some supportive policy is warranted. But it often sounds as if when you just have some skills training and remaining open to trade and some supportive programs, soft touch industrial policies, that is all developing countries can do today. I think there's a lot of evidence showing that that's not enough. And I don't want to go into too much depth there, because there are recent papers on SEZs and their limited linkages to the domestic economy. Andreoni and Tregana in the recent paper actually show that China is the only country that has increased foreign value added in its exports, which means integrating into GVCs, and then subsequently increased domestic value added, which means linking back. Other countries have not managed to do that at all. So when we look back, and I want to keep this short because we're all very familiar, I guess, with the East Asian newly industrializing countries, but I just want to emphasize this particular aspect of backward integration. So there's data by a German economist from a research project in South Korea and Taiwan, data from the early 1980s, which I think is most interesting because that data is at the end of the heavy chemical industry push. So actually when the government has tried to backward integrate. And what you can see is that both countries have really successfully managed to integrate their export industries with the domestic economy by building up capital goods sectors and intermediate goods sectors. And you can see that for South Korea in 1978, the local content in textiles and in cotton clothing, but even in electronics and automobiles, local content shares of more than 70%, which is unheard of nowadays. I mean, there are reasons for that, but still. And you can see, for example, that in the case of steel, the backward integration happens step by step, from iron making to steel rolling. And it could happen because of the downstream demand from the shipbuilding sector, the automotive sector. And what's also important to emphasize here is that even in those cases, backward integration did not mean blind import substitutions. And there were many semi-processed products for the downstream use. When they were not locally available or not immediately localizable, they were still imported. Raw materials were almost always imported. That was never an aspect of the backward integration. And the industrial policy being used was very selective, always a switch between ISI and EOI. So ISI policies, import substitution, and export-oriented industrial policies. And China has actually done something very similar. So just one last word on that I mentioned already, the heavy chemical industry drive. You can see on the left-hand side the kind of industries that were covered under this. Lots of intermediate goods sectors. And there's a paper by Nathan Lane, which actually shows, analyzing input-output tables, that this HCI push was successful. It increased productivity in the targeted industries, but also through linkages benefited other industries. And it was long-lasting. It didn't just stop when the policy stopped. And again, just to emphasize, I'm not saying anything about pure ISI. It's always important to export. For example, in this book by Studwell, How Asia Works, he describes how POSCO, the South African steel factory, was actually directly at the sea. Raw material comes in on the one side and the finished product goes out on the other side. So it was always set up as an export industry, but also domestically integrated through intermediate goods. I don't want to spend too much time on the theoretical framework, but it was actually really interesting to go back to some of the writings of the classic development economists, especially Hirschman and Nick Kaldor, and even Alan Young, to see how they have theorized about that. And Philip Toner has written a book in 1999 looking at all these different theories, also looking at Murdal and Norkse and how they actually conceptualized it, some better than others. So Hirschman really had a focus on the linkages between industries, whereas Rosenstein, Rodin, and Norkse, they focused more on the final goods linkages. So intermediate goods are also manufacturers. So the increasing returns effects of manufacturers that Kaldor emphasized are then multiplied throughout the economy if you backward integrate. So actually, a lot of the state-of-the-art literature agrees with what the World Development Report says. Richard Baldwin says developing countries should join supply chains. They should not try to build them domestically, and the policies of the past don't work anymore. Giraffe and Sturgeon conclude something very similar. There can be no return to the old policies. And then there's this very recent book from last year by Hugh Whitaker, Tim Sturgeon, and co-authors on compressed development, where they argue that the catch-up route that East Asia took is blocked, and a thin industrialization is simply a reality that developing countries have to live with, because this kind of backward integration is no longer possible. When looking at the South African case, I have taken input-output tables from two different sources. One source has imported inputs included, and the other one has it excluded. And when you calculate the multiplier from these input-output tables, you see that the multiplier including imported inputs has increased a lot over the last 20 years. Whereas when you exclude imported inputs, so that's just the sales between domestic industries, you see that there's not a change at all. So the domestic integration with the existing upstream sectors that you actually have in South Africa, there's a steel industry, there's a petrochemicals industry, there's an aluminum industry, but they're very weakly integrated with the downstream sectors, especially automotive. So I would argue that going forward, and I mean, in the Q&A, if somebody's interested, I can go more into the details about why they are so weakly integrated. That has a lot to do with the realities of the automotive global value chain, which is all about scale. And if you don't have the production volumes domestically, you cannot backward integrate. But there are also some policy failures, I would argue. And I think that this emphasis that the World Development Report takes, just saying that linking up to global value chains is enough, I think there's time to focus again more on the domestic integration, because there are still some possibilities. It has gotten more difficult, especially to pool the downstream demand from different sectors, because there are so many different grades of steel. But actually completely giving up on the backward integration, I would argue, is not really talking about catch-up industrialization. So Andreoni and Tregana in their piece also emphasized this, that after linking up, it's very important to link back. And I think it's also important to look at different global value chains, because they have very different realities. The automotive global value chain is very different from the electronics or the apparel. So one has to look at the lead firm strategies and what kind of localization can be undertaken together with the lead firms. Because without the lead firms, for example, especially in automotive, it will be impossible. It's arguably a more delicate matter now, but the intervention I wanted to bring to the table today is just, if we look at the East Asian experience and if we look at the theory about increasing returns and catch-up industrialization, then I think one cannot give up on trying to backward integrate and think about this very carefully.
2 minutes, please.
Yes, so just the last point. There's a working paper by Robert Wade from 2018, which is also talking about the East Asian experience and argues that backward integration has never meant to try and do everything. So when some of the current publications like the World Development Report say that the ISI policies are no longer possible, it's still relevant to go back to the East Asian experience and look how exactly they have done it, how they ensured that the required intermediate inputs could still be imported while not jeopardizing the competitiveness of the export industries. And Jostein Hauge, for example, has written a paper on that as well. So let me just conclude on that point. And if there are any more questions, especially on the South African case, I'm happy to say more about that as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Tobias. Thanks for keeping to time again. So we move on now to the final presentation, which is Pritish Bahuria from the University of Manchester. And then we will have an open discussion about all the presentation. Same deal, Pritish, 15 minutes, please fire away.
No favoritism for me, but thanks everyone. Firstly, thanks to our panelists. It's been great across the two panels, really great papers. Thanks to Tom for co-chairing and organizing with me. And thanks also to the DSA and UEA for hosting us. This is the launch of our study group. So please do sign up. We have an ad at some point. I put it on the chat as well. And thank you all for also attending the last paper of the last panel of the conference. So, oh, sorry. 1 second, it's not showing up. Shit. Okay. I have a more simplified title now. So then my complicated one. What I'm going to do today is we've heard a lot about global development being talked about at the conference. What it means is still very unclear to a lot of people. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the framing of it and the environment in which it's framed. And I'm going to do this by using Bob Jessup's concept of academic capitalism, and then talk a little bit about the rise of global development. And then I'll talk about what it means in terms of Wittgenstein's use of language games and how you give words meaning, and what that means in terms of paradigms and the useful enemies that are caused. Overall, I kind of see global as a misdirection, which misses out on the whole idea of development. There's something Andrew Fisher has talked about, Hao-Jun Chang, of course, Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, etc. But basically, it ends up continuing the status quo by misdirecting our attention and changing little in terms of what is prioritized within development in terms of methods, priority, and positionality. So Bob Jessup uses this term called academic capitalism, which we are all guilty of, right? We are all guilty of it. So there's a marketization of higher education, placing universities in competition. We are all very aware of all of this, of ref, placing universities in competition for one another because of the privatization of higher education, trying to get grants, endowments, student income, etc. Also leading to competition individually in a term he uses that applies to everyone called academic entrepreneurialism, right? And that works in very different ways, etc. Now, development studies has a particular function within this in the sense that it is an interdisciplinary space. It is externally facing, and in terms of the global element of it. But it also, so it gives itself a position of hosting and becoming a center of inter and multidisciplinary grants. Of course, the Global Challenges Research Fund, but also in terms of linking with DFID in the past, you had a whole set of departments named themselves International Department of International Development in the past as well. Now, broadly speaking, though, development studies departments come from very different traditions in the UK, right? But there is some degree of convergence, firstly at the DSA in terms of trying to represent it as a discipline, a field, collectively, but also at REF, where you try to decide which articles are higher ranked than the other. But there is obviously resistance to that. And I think in that resistance to this try to convergence within the discipline, there is that incoherence gives productive possibilities. This is, of course, linking to Hirschman's ideas, etc. But there has also been this proliferation of undergrad and postgraduate degrees. So the development studies is really occupying a central place broadly within academic capitalism. So let's think about how this idea was really conceived. Of course, broadly, globally, in terms of the events, you had the financial crisis, you had the rise of China, you had the Sustainable Development Goals, the end of the Millennium Development Goals. Importantly, in this country, for UK development studies departments, you had Brexit. So there was already talk of ending AIDS from Brexiteers. And of course, there was an idea if you're trying to shift focus to the UK, is there an alignment with Brexiteer discourses, right? Of course, this is really difficult because for the development studies departments, you are quite reliant on DFID income. And obviously most people are quite proponents of aid as well. So the trajectory of this was really in terms of this created a set of structures that allowed people, allow different academics and a wide range of academics globally to try to give meaning to this word. So what does global development mean? At my own university, this was about representing it as converging divergence. Now, converging divergence was an argument that was based on two sets of indicators. That is GDP and Human Development Index. This is the mainstream of what development is thought about. And the argument was that there is increasing convergence between two categories of countries, North and South, while there is increasing evidence of sustained within country inequalities. Okay. Now there are several problems with this, but we'll come on to this a bit later. There was another idea that there is global interconnectedness, and this has been specified across the conference as well. Of course, we all know that this is not the first pandemic either. So there has been pandemics before. Also, sustainable development was cast as this kind of, we have to act globally to address climate change, but that obscures any kind of historical responsibility whatsoever, right? So in terms of pushing this idea, there was a development change forum around a particular paper where the paper was widely criticized for sloppy use of data, erasing history because it used 1990 to 2015, therefore condoning neoliberalism, for example, according to Andrew Fisher, ignoring colonialism, like Laura and Tina mentioned, and obscuring differences within the South. A rejoinder was written which used the language of defense in terms of this being a stylized fact, converging divergence, and that this was a purely empirical exercise. Ben Fine argues that this is the language of neoclassical economics, which usually defends on the basis of this positivist language when he talked about whether a paradigm shift was happening in his 2002 article on world development. Then, of course, a case was made for global development again during COVID-19. The borders were becoming increasingly salient in everyone's life, really. And the time was for not just a new development, but it was also in terms of sending it to global health too. But also there was increasing institutional usage in terms of changing names at the DSA, a lot of language of global development. There's also a push for a journal of global development. Now, I think it's important in terms of thinking about the broader paradigms to actually try to link with the broader usage of the term. For example, Kuhn talks about a constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and groups commitments shared by members of a given community founded on a particular set of axioms, models, and exemplars. So some people have defended this on the basis of positivism, a very a basic sense of positivism, and the lack of distinguishing between different forms of positivism and constructivism as a continuum rather than static categories. So positivist attitudes of looking at development paradigms as a science would only see one paradigm, right? And Kuhn talks about this in great detail. But interdisciplinary development studies, as development studies was initially formed, valued different forms of evidence of competing paradigms, and what counts as evidence mattered, right? And how you explain anomalies matters. I won't go through, hopefully I can go through this fully, but this is a brief sketch that I've done. So 1950s to 1970s, actually often we wrongly class the dominant paradigm as modernization. That is a complete error in my mind. It's basically between balanced versus unbalanced growth, and Lewis versus Hirschman and others. At that time, development was cast as growth and structural transformation, with production-centered development at the center. You had countercurrents, and you had a clear anomaly in terms of supposedly poor outcomes associated with ISI. Then you had neoliberalism rising, growth became central to development, production-centered development was wiped out. Neoclassical economics, particularly exchange-centered understandings of neoclassical economists became development, another anomaly rising, East Asia. So much has been written about this paradigm shift from Wade to Fine to others, to Gore. And then there were different kinds of paradigms. This has been called good governance, human development, post-Washington consensus, as you like. There was also a growth and human capabilities became broadly what we conceive of as development. Now, there was an important push here. Hajun Chang and Antonio Andreoni called this the humanist push for understanding development. And politics of capabilities became thinking of individuals as central to development, right? And the dominant methodology was new institutional economics, but this allowed for multidisciplinary approaches to become central because you're analyzing the social now. So politics, etc., could become central as a framework in line with mimicking American social science and trends, but accept neoclassical economics as the only way of understanding economics. So you have various references to, I don't know what the economists say, or they are the technical technicians, whereas not actually analyzing whether what they say is right. You analyze that as fact, as positive as fact, whereas breaking that down. This regularly happens. You can see it in place throughout. There are countercurrents, and then the China's rapid rise as well, right? Coming. Now, how do you analyze the anomalies? Some people have analyzed it even in this panel as China's rise. Others have analyzed this as a broader global south. Okay, so then you have the global development push. And my argument really is that So now what we have is neoclassical economics plus other disciplines and making development micro again. So not MAGA, but MDMA instead. Okay? So what you have here is, in terms of thinking about paradigms, Hirschman was always against this in a way. He always talked, for example, he writes, an important role has no doubt been played by the desperate need on the part of the hegemonic powers or those working there for shortcuts to the understanding of multifarious reality that must be coped with and controlled and therefore understood all at once. There is a real need, which many people who try to center the understanding of diverse economic trajectories don't fully understand, the need to try to understand the whole world at once through basic concepts. So there's a need to kind of give meaning to these words, right? Global and international means closely aligned things in the dictionary, but of course you need to give it meaning. So the meaning of a word is its use in the language according to Wittgenstein. So let the use of the words teach you their meaning. But words have power and their meaning changes, especially as concept. And this is exactly what's happening in terms of linking global development to converging divergence, because it bases a kind of evidence base for this push for this new paradigm. And of course, we are very familiar about how you collectivize strength around a particular concept, you create an enemy. And the enemy is the evil international development. We are familiar with how this happens in terms of European state formation, in terms of an external enemy strengthening coalitions. Patrick Thalia-Jackson talks about rhetorical commonplaces being used in terms of the West against the rest, in terms of after post-war Europe. So global, in my view, is a kind of a misdirection. There is evil international development as an enemy, but obviously previous paradigms were all based on schools of economic thought. Ignoring it means you can kind of stay the same in relation to that. You don't have to tackle that at all. Now, this is also, there is reasons why people push this analysis, and that is because American social science usually derives development studies on the basis of Truman's 1949 address, which paints the image of ideas as a kind of a North-South enterprise. This obscures, of course, the Southern origins of development. Andrew Fisher has talked about this. Eric Helleiner separately has talked about this. From Nyerere to Nehru, China's own use of the term, 1918 onwards, Latin American use of the term, obscures any possibilities of South-side alliance against the West. So the West is no longer the enemy here, right? It becomes an ally, which is, it can be, sure, but that is the impact of that. Still, the task of post-war development, and this is extremely important, it was born in colonialism and is also largely capitalist, and therefore necessarily, from a Marxian perspective, uneven, unequal, and violent.
2 minutes, British.
Okay. So I think one of the most dangerous things global development does is it's appropriating decolonizing. It breaks North-South binaries, so it lures you in by highlighting better performance elsewhere, showing that people are poor in the UK too, which is true. But capitalism is always universal. Dislocation is always universal as a process of capitalism, but it's always received differently. And this is any kind of basic Marx heterodox interpretation. There's nothing new about this. Developing countries, though, is also a political category, especially at a time of COVID when vaccine distribution is so clear. It's a political category formally in multilateral institutions. So by breaking that, what is the impact for development studies, new paradigm, and the salience of inequality at the intercountry level, when clearly this manufacturing and the formal institutions against technological acquisition are so clear right now? So countries have always performed better in some respects. We know this in development studies. The reason why there was no mono economics initially was because of two things. There was, Keynes talked about full employment in the industrialized countries and underemployment in other countries, right? And other structures talked about undiversified economic structures versus others. And that was the core of what distinguished developing from developed countries. And ultimately, decolonizing is about multiple positionalities. And as Laura and Tin talk about, this is about universalizing decolonizing. It's very different from India to African universities to how it's conceived here in the UK university. I think it's important, though, global development makes much of a case of saying how it analyzes countercurrents within broader development studies, about the broader intellectual environment in which we work, that global development arose during a time when Brexit discourses were rising. But this is largely ignored within a justification of the paradigm to look internally. But what about development? So what is different about global development? Global development is now framed as an individualized emancipatory project. This is exactly the same as what's said in good governance. I mean, we've been hearing for the last 20 years. What is new about this at all? There's globalization hysteria. Maybe development studies departments are increasingly being taken over by geographers, as Henry Bernstein argued about 10 to 15 years ago. But see no state borders as relevant. There is an elephant in the room about structural transformation, especially now. This is something that structuralists from Hirschman to Tandika Mukandawir to Alice Hamsden to Hajin Chang have constantly discussed. And I think it's really important to think about this and just perhaps reread Hirschman's The Rise and Decline of Development Economics, and just how much this was predicted and it continues to be in place. How early development economics, and this case for structuralist discourses, are completely marginalized as this push for status quo maintains. So why is this paradigm maintenance there? There's status quo in terms of conceptualizing development. There's an inaccurate explanation of what's changed or prompted a shift. There's maintenance of a multidisciplinary emphasis with economics imperialism at its center. And there's the commandeering of progressive decolonizing narratives, which in effect ends up being recolonizing. Yeah, thanks so much, Evian.
Okay, thank you very much, British. I'm sure we're going to have loads of questions about all of these fantastic presentations. So feel free. I mean, my preference after a year and a half of online teaching would be for people to speak, or rather than put in the chat box, but you're welcome to use the chat box too. So Andy Sumner's raised a hand. Maybe I'll take a round of questions. But Andy, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. This is all really interesting. It's really nice to see a kind of a broader discussion about the state of development studies as well. I guess my question is, okay, so there's global development. If you look around, at least with a UK lens, you see another form of development studies which dominates a lot of departments, which is kind of, I don't know what you call it, fragile studies. So fragile, failed states. I don't agree with the terms. I'm just using the terms as they're used. And it's sort of a kind of, a focus on the poorest countries. I wondered how you situate some of these sort of competing approaches to development studies. And then let me put my head on the line. At King's, when we set up the new department, the only reason we used international development is because marketing says no one knows what development studies is. They'll think you're teaching psychology or something. So my question is, what do you call a degree in development studies these days? And how do you see global development alongside either that kind of failed fragile states type approach to development studies, and also what we've been trying to do, which is basically to just look at the study of socioeconomic change in parts of the world that are rapidly changing. We've ended up using a label that I think is problematic, but it's the only one we could come up with, which was emerging economies. And so broadly speaking, we've focused on middle-income countries, but we've never defined what that means, thank goodness. It's more a question of, there are countries that have changed very rapidly over the last 30 or 40 years. What do we learn from the study of socioeconomic change with reference to those countries? And then you go through, there's all the usual things about trying to build an international department with the contradiction of having that department based in London and set up by two white men. Yeah, that kind of rambling is, I guess, what do you think of the other approaches to development studies, and what would you call a degree in development studies? By implication, what would you call the Development Studies Association? Thank you.
I don't see any other hands at the moment, but I'm also not very good at this Zoom thing, apparently, but I can't see any other hands. So unless I'm wrong, do you want to just take that question, Pritish, and then other people, please do raise your hands or put something in the chat box for any of the panelists.
Laura, it may touch on what you and Tin talked about as well. I mean, for me, I think what I'm trying to analyze in this paper, which is still early stages, of course, is to think about how language gets meaning and how it's legitimized. I think there's a problem in development studies, which I don't think which anyone will ever be able to get rid of, is the colonial history. But that doesn't mean a single word can actually get rid of it. We just have to kind of deal with it and recognize it. The challenge, I think, is that most people a lot of teaching ends up just ignoring colonialism completely. And that still happens today. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, because I don't think there's an easy normative position. And I think there needs to be more recognition that it's okay not to be okay with it. You know, you can work through it, because that incoherence is what gives productive possibilities.
Can I add something here? So I think this question about the kind of fragile and failed is also about a kind of shift of resources away from states who are concerned about the middle classes because they're taxpayers and they pay for public services within countries, towards focusing things on the very poor. This is something that Tandika talked about in terms of social policy. And I think that this shift is kind of segmenting countries, you know, and separating out kind of middle class groups from the very poor. And it's kind of, you know, I think it's interesting to think at scales and the way that different scales are kind of enforced or removed. So like there's a good thing about international in the sense that it kind of recognizes that nations are like in a trading system with each other and there's hierarchies there. And like global, if you're talking about like global infrastructures, that's kind of helpful because it makes you see about the connections. So there's always good and bad things about different scales. But I do think this kind of shift of resources to the very poorest is kind of fracturing, you know, the connections within states where you know, you would want to have people building cross-class solidarity around kind of development as a kind of, you know, sovereign project. And so I do think that's another way in which kind of scales are collapsed in a way that's kind of quite, you know, nasty in a way. I think this question about development, I mean, I've thought about this. My course is called African Development. And I would kind of prefer it to have the word kind of capitalism and colonialism in it. But I recognize that at the departmental, we're actually really interested in different things. Like there are some people who are interested in kind of humanitarian things and emergencies. And then the economists in my department are kind of pretty much all neoclassical economists. So at the departmental level, we're never going to kind of call the whole department colonialism studies, you know, which is what maybe some people in the department would want it to be called. So I also think that these word choices are kind of about what can people agree on who don't really agree on anything. And so they're not really kind of thoughtful. They're just kind of like, we can't really have a discussion on what development is. So let's just have some generic name that means nothing, but is like good for marketing purposes. So that's my kind of understanding about like these names. They're basically like trying to be as uncontroversial as possible within the departmental context.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. They're also, of course, you know, it's master's programs are very much about career path, and the international development signals a career, whereas global development doesn't necessarily in the same way, or colonialism studies. So I think that's really significant. We've got a few more questions coming in. I feel that we could talk about these issues quite a lot, but I just want to remind people that obviously the other presenters as well. I mean, I have some questions for them, but I'll leave them for now and take questions from Sam and Kate.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the presentations. They were great. I mean, I also have questions for Tadashi and so on, but I will just come in on this debate if that's okay, and it relates to points raised by Andy, Laura, and Pritish there about, okay, what to do, what to call these different strands of development studies. I mean, there's a nice piece which I find useful that touches on some of this by Bob Curry-Older, who argues that you've actually got three types of development. You've got global development, the realm of climate change and the agencies around that. You've got national development with a whole set of countries who don't need aid anymore, who would previously have fallen into the orbit of typical international development exchanges, but Nigeria, etc., and so on. These are aid's a bit part. And then you've got the types of countries that Andy's talking about, the fragile, if you like, ones that are needing humanitarian responses, etc., etc. These are the three different ones. That's one way in which you could mobilize different versions. I think the one reason why I've got a bit of sympathy for the global development framing, and I somewhat disagree with Pritish's representation of it, is that I don't think we should just think about it. I think we should think about it in the way that knowledge is socially produced in particular contexts via Kuhn, absolutely. But it's not just that. If it was just that, then no one else would have spotted it outside of UK academia. And the fact that you've got the Canadian Development Studies Association, the Nordic Development Studies Association writing about all of this as well. This isn't just a sort of ref and UK positionality debate. There's something about the way in which global processes of development are unfolding at the moment that is causing a degree of rethinking. And to me, that isn't about divergence and convergence. That's a misplaced argument. I completely buy the critiques in that. But there are things that have changed in terms of the global nature of challenges around climate change and a whole set of other things, migration, now pandemics, etc. Maybe not change, maybe we're always there and are more prominent. What I like about it in particular is it tells us that there's something about global capitalism that is unfolding in ways that are, in North and South that we need to interrogate. And to me, it puts capitalism right back at the centre of development studies, which it hasn't always been at all. And that's probably the single biggest reason why I think the global turn is useful. And another one is that it does de-provincialise, I think, development studies. It stops it being about the northern gaze on the problematic South, and allows some of that gaze to be turned back. I haven't yet seen it capture the decolonising turn in a way that you quite suggested there. I'm not sure it has that power. So I'm not too worried about that just yet. But it might. I'm looking forward to debating with people who know much more about the decolonising debate as to whether or not it is a useful umbrella for them. We've had this debate internally in Manchester. Some think it clearly is, some not. But yeah, I think there's some actual real world reasons to take global development seriously that play back to the classic concerns of original development theory as well as decolonising. So I think it's a useful move.
Okay, Kate.
Thanks, and thanks for that, Pritish. That was really interesting. I've been hopping a bit, but I managed to catch your presentation. I was quite interested by two things that you said. One of them is this whole idea of the shift to global development, and I am equally suspicious, as you clearly are, about why this is happening. And what it puts me in mind of is a quotation I came across once, which I can't fully remember, but it was something along the lines of claims to common interests are the way that powerful people lay claims to the resources of others. So whenever somebody talks about, divergent convergence, globalization or development is now global, I just start thinking, okay, what resources of others do people who actually insist on the importance of private property now want to lay claim to? And certainly one of the things is going to be labor. We have aging societies in the West, so both markets and workers are going to be harder to come by. And a lot of the trends, trends in digital labor lead in that direction. I think the whole shift to digital economies is very much a part of that process. There are environmental issues. I can remember back in the 90s when the whole plant genetic resources was big. Suddenly everybody was talking about our global common good because most of the plant genetic resources were in developing countries. Once all these gene banks and whatever were established, suddenly everybody was patenting the products of these things like crazy and they were being privatized. So I think one of the other things to look at is who is making these claims of global development. And I agree with Sam that there are ways in which this could be a productive thing. But my sense is the people who are deriving this global development narrative are not the ones who are thinking along the lines that Sam and others who think of a productive direction are thinking. They're the same guys who celebrate global common good and create a vaccine regime in which only the West gets the vaccines and everybody else gets the leftovers. So yeah, I think we need to look at the power relations that operate under the claims to resources that otherwise would be trumped by sovereignty and private property and things like that, that are part of what's driving a new kind of rescaling of access to resources. But on the other side, I think that there doesn't have to be only one approach to development at any given time. So you're showing sort of broad shifts in approaches, but you're also showing that's always been fragmented. There's always been the structuralists alongside the neoclassicals or the dependency theorists alongside the modernists. And I think the decolonizing thinking urges us again to remember that there are different perspectives. For example, you talk about the Truman narrative of the start of development. Well, people like Thandika always talk about Bandung Conference, and they look at development and frame development from that conference, which was a conference of nations of the global South laying out their ideas of what development ought to be. And similarly now, there are great development thinkers that look at new ways of framing development. Thandika's work, Mamdani's work. Mamdani talks about the tension between, what was the term now? Different kinds of universals, abstract universals and analytical universals, which says basically the universals that were given from development theory are stultifying, but we can take any development process anywhere in the world and say, we can learn something from this, and you can take something from that's happening in an African country, look at the pattern, the process, and use that to explain things in other countries. So we can also learn from Africa in the same way that Africa can learn from us. So I think those are the kind of processes that decenter what development is, that could be part of how we can think about development as a valuable intellectual endeavor without having to invest ourselves in the framing of the most powerful forces of what development is.
Thank you very much, Kate. This is a very rich discussion. I'm quite conscious of time. I don't want to be too authoritarian. Emma, you had your hand up. Was it another question on this issue or for one of the others?
It was. It would be largely repetitive. I'd much rather it went to somebody else.
I might, unless there's any others, I might fire in with a few questions for the others myself, and then maybe if we've got time, Emma, we can come back, because I'd very happily talk about all this. There's so much to say, but I just want to ask a few things to the other presenters. So for Laura and Tin, I really like the way you brought in China as a way of unsettling the converging divergence argument, because the more obvious thing to do in a way is to say, well, you know, it's China that makes things look like they're converging when there are many countries that aren't converging. But you said actually China itself is not converging. And I thought that was really interesting. I agree, by the way, that I think it's the converging divergence bit of global development in a way becomes problematic. But what would it mean for your argument if you think about, let's say, the other emerging markets, right? Whether it's BRICS or other, you know, middle income countries. How does it look if we take our gaze a bit away from China? With just one question there. For Tadashi, I just had a question about the strong and weak sustainability, which was, I think, what would it mean for the SDGs to take a strong approach to sustainability? Is that even possible? And could you have a strong approach to sustainability within some of the SDGs, but not others? And then, for Tobias, I just had a question, we may not get to all these things, about the GVCs and services, because I'm wondering I don't know the GVC literature well. Pritish and I did some work around the attempt to kind of leapfrog manufacturing to services, and there's a whole literature on leapfrogging, you know, polluting industries. And I, you know, to what extent do you think global value chains in services is kind of a relevant concept in relation to economies that are trying to perhaps avoid manufacturing altogether? Where do services fit into that? So those are a few questions. I don't know, maybe some quick responses if you have time.
Shall I start? Yeah, it's quick. So I think it's unrealistic to employ strong sustainability in the SDGs, because if so, most likely SDG would be too radical, and then it'll be dismissed by the mainstream. So it's the other extreme, because it's similar to the case of MDGs, because it's focusing on poverty reduction without much content on the growth perspective. It's rather about redistribution, which does not attract the powerful. So the same applies to the strong sustainability. So that's why for political feasibility, in terms of the political feasibility, weak sustainability is one way to remain as an alternative. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I should just say, I realised we've got till 4. I was thinking we only had till 3:45, which is why I was slightly panicking. So we've got till 4, hooray. So yeah, any further questions on any of the issues, please do come forward. If either Tobias or Laura and Tim want to take my questions, maybe
Yeah.
you can.
So I also wanted to respond to Sam's point about like what's useful about global development. And I am a little bit kind of cynical about this idea that there's like some new, more global pattern of accumulation. I feel like kind of it's always been global. It's just now that it's kind of not working for people in high income countries. They're kind of searching about for an explanation. And they're kind of seeing, you know, looking at the kind of globe to see what happens, you know. And I kind of tend to think about this kind of idea that it's about rentierism as this kind of sense that when rents in the neoclassical framework are basically things that shouldn't exist in markets. And so when there's a problem with capitalism that is not working in the ways that you kind of previously thought it worked, then the answer to that must be rents, you know. And I think that the kind of I think rents have changed, but I think that the rents were always there in the past. There was just rent sharing going on within high income countries. And now that rent sharing is gone, they're kind of now talking about this rise of rents, but it's just a kind of, you know, the rents, it's just the rents have been kind of changed. So I'm a bit critical of this idea that there's some big shift going on. I think it's more that, you know, that if there's something wrong with capitalism in high income countries, we have to look at the rest of the world to understand it. That, I don't know if that's a coherent response, but I am a bit kind of cynical about the idea that this kind of capitalism is more global. I think it always has been. It's just like the way that it's been understood and classified. So to respond to Tom's point, I guess the argument is precisely that China isn't a kind of stand-in because it's converging in a way that a lot of other countries can't converge in. So the idea, sort of using it as an example of the rise of the South is like doubly confusing, because it's like China is able to do things that so many other countries can't do. So if you're using that as an example of the rise of the South, then it's kind of like, that's kind of nonsensical, right? So I don't know if that kind of responds to your question. I think the other point about that is that because China is kind of, some of what it's doing is like so peculiar and particular to China, it also kind of talks about it kind of touches upon this idea that the way that the capitalism works is by nature not very kind of useful as a kind of source of development for other countries, because if we're just kind of replicating a sort of similar kind of hierarchy between China and other countries of the world, then it's kind of, in some ways, China represents this kind of like, we're doing things differently and we're succeeding, but in relation to other countries, it's kind of similar kinds of dynamics. So again, it's kind of like not really a kind of not really a model of divergence. So there is a kind of tension there. I don't know if Tin wants to add anything to that point.
Yeah, no, exactly. I wanted to add, no, we're not saying that China is not converging. And in terms of incomes, like it's clearly converging. We're saying that the path it has adopted is not similar to that, like, abstract way described in some of these narratives about global convergence, but it's very peculiar. And China has some characteristics that have allowed it to achieve things that other countries have not achieved. And actually, Tobias mentioned that in his presentation by saying it was actually one of the only countries, the only country that has managed to increase knowledge in its and technology and value addition in its exports. And we see that, it's linked to the peculiar experience of China, its policies, its experiences, and we're trying to move away from like this big general narrative that obscures more than it explains things.
Thank you. Yeah. I meant, it's converging in one sense, but not in another. I think that's what's interesting. You could almost go further and say, like, it's almost misleading to use the term converging just because it's becoming rich, right? But there's something else altogether that's been going on.
Can I ask a question to Toby as well? Thanks, Tobias. I really enjoyed your presentation, actually, and it was really interesting to talk about the thinning out of development. My question is, especially in terms of the possibilities for industrialization in the auto sector. I guess I have two questions. One, do you think your arguments are specific to the auto sector? Or is it relevant for other industrial sectors as well? And the second is just more inquisitive on my part, like how are you going to develop the study a bit further in terms of case studies, etc.?
Yeah, so perhaps let me just take the two questions, but also on China, I think it's very interesting that China is actually, if you look at GVCs, blocking the way for many countries in manufacturing, because you just can't compete against the productivity. Maybe now that wages are going up, but if you look at the auto industry, for example, there is almost no other country that can compete in the products that are globally traded. I mean, in automotive, there's a lot of regionalization, but with tires, for example, it's almost impossible to compete. But on the services question, I mean, there is some literature on that, for example, by people like John Page. I think he's based at Wider, where they've written a book. It's called Industries Without Smokestacks. So can services, can tourism deliver the same things that manufacturing used to do? I'm actually quite, let's say the literature is actually quite skeptical on that. I think especially also in GVCs and productive capabilities literature that looks at manufacturing. I think leapfrogging manufacturing into services, I don't know. I mean, South Africa is very strong in business services, for example. That's actually a success story where they have managed to tap into that global value chain. And then there's also the argument by Richard Baldwin again, where he says now is the rise of technology and telemobility, and teleworking will come up as an opportunity. When you have a situation in Kenya where people are writing or tutoring students in the US, you can call that a global value chain as well. But I mean, what used to be special about manufacturing in the past, the linkages, the increasing returns, the learning, I think services cannot deliver on that. But actually, together with my supervisor, we're thinking about conceptualizing this, like what actually makes manufacturing special and what is still possible today. Because clearly, as the argument I've presented shows, a lot of the things are no longer possible. And then on your question, Pritish, I think the auto sector is obviously very specific in terms of the amount of linkages that are possible. For example, if you look at apparel, there's the linkage to textile, and then also to some petrochemicals and agriculture. But automotive has much broader source of linkages. But I think therefore it's a very useful sector to actually show how extremely difficult it is to backward integrate nowadays. with what I mentioned, like there are, I don't know how many thousand types of polymers. So if you don't have what the OEMs that you have in South Africa, if you don't have that, they will import. And yeah, maybe we just have to give up on that idea of domestic integration. But how I want to look at that more in depth is through case studies of the link between aluminium and auto, between polymers and auto, and steel and auto in South Africa. That's actually what I'm doing currently, and try to get a bit better idea of how exactly this plays out.
Thanks, Tobias. You may be interested maybe in talking to Shamil Azmi. He does a lot of research. He may still be here on automotives. He even has a picture of wiring harnesses in his office. Anyway, but no, thank you so much for engaging so much with the presentation and all the panels. I think they're really useful reflections from everyone. I read James Klopstick's comments as well, which are really useful. We are thinking about possibly having a through the Politics and Political Economy workshop, possibly having a future workshop about this, future of development studies kind of workshop. But we'll be in touch about that, especially if you can sign up for the mailing list. Sorry, I keep advertising this.
It's good because I haven't been doing it, but we're not done yet. We still have time, and I mean, it's worth everyone looking at James Klopstick's comment because it's very interesting, but it's more of a comment, so I won't read it out. But there is a question from Uma for you, Tobias, about the pandemic and how that relates to GVCs and whether it changes the argument in some way. So that would be interesting if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, I actually forgot to answer.
To answer what?
The questions.
Oh
yeah, maybe we can hear Emma's question as well.
Yeah, let's have Emma's question. Emma, are you still here?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think I'm really rehashing old ground. Is that through a couple of these presentations over the course of the conference, I mean, we do seem to sometimes, describe one thing and critique another. And I really just want to echo what James and Kate have said, actually. How are we careful? And I mentioned in a previous panel, reviewing papers and again coming across this critique of development studies that seems to me to be sort of critiquing, if you like, kind of hegemonic development thinking from the World Bank rather than contemporary development studies as represented here. So it's just a plea to parse out what we're talking about in any one moment, because it's easy to do, isn't it? And I'm guilty of it myself for sure, but it does matter quite a lot. Anyway, so it's just an additional point, and I just want to say what a fantastic and interesting panel this has been. So on to a more substantive question.
Yeah,
it really has. That's do you want to respond, British?
Yeah, sure. First, I guess I'll start with Emma. I think this is a frustration of mine for sure. I mean, one thing I've seen a lot across different departments is when you teach early development economics, you just target it with Rostow and say, oh, that's it. Such an easy target, I mean, this is a normal thing. I do it as well. You make an easy target, you collectivize around it, and then you obscure everything else. I guess it's a normal ploy in academic writing, but I guess it's good for us to be more aware of these kind of differences. And I think, so just related to Sam's point, the rise of global development, I think it's really exciting, Sam's book with Indrajit Roy in particular, and how he takes that forward in the future conversations and stuff as well. I guess because in a way also it'll push the discussion of politics in a certain direction. And that is, of course, will continue to be negotiated. And I think his point, though, about Norway, I think it's really because of the Sustainable Development Goals, no? I mean, that's why a lot of people change their name to global. I don't think this is a bad thing. Words are just words, but when you give them meaning, that's when things can get contested. And everyone does it, so it's pretty normal, but I think this should be negotiated. And then Kate raises this point, I think a very important point about, there being the need for this pluralism, this counter currents and dominant paradigms, and us recognizing that they operate within each other. And that's what development studies has always been good about, because through that incoherence and negotiation, that's where the creativity and productive possibilities may come, if you think about it from a Hirschman perspective kind of thing. But the challenge right now with sustainable development, I think, is a greater one, because the challenge here is a much more rationalized version of what development studies should be. That is, look at environment scientific teams, much more positivism, and it breeds a kind of adherence to a certain kind of evidence and a collectivization of that evidence, which will inevitably obscure dissent. And I think that's, I mean, it's not inevitable, but it's quite possible that that is going to happen. So retaining that spaces for perhaps disagreement, I think, is important. I mean, different departments will do this to a different degree, of course, but it will happen.
Thank you. Just before we wrap up, oh, Emma and James both have their hands up.
Yeah.
Quick questions?
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick thought. So I was introduced recently, or a couple of years ago, to the idea of post-critical thinking through the work of Rita Felsky. It was Paul Gilbert who put me her way. Now, we may well ask what. She mainly writes about literary and cultural studies. But in some ways, some of her writing is extraordinary, I think, for thinking about the conduct and practice of academia. And I'm thinking about what Tadashi was saying about how do you engage between the sort of hegemonic and the, if you like, the more radicals, and how do you, I mean, I thought Tadashi, yours was a really actually very ambitious and really brave kind of maneuver, as you know, because we do live in the real world and we do have those, as I can't remember who else was talking about academic entrepreneurialism, was saying, you know, we are imperfect, and we are also kind of making our own individual and institutional ways through the world. But post-critical thinking, I'm going to try and write something about it, but I would urge everyone to go and have a look at Rita Felsky's book. And it captures some of this, which is how do we write with a willingness to listen, an eagerness to listen, a willingness to critique? How do we engage with each other's work? And it has larger sort of implications for how we theorize the world. Anyway, it's just a flag if anyone's interested. I read, gosh, which one was it? Critique and Post-Critique. Anyway, Rita Felsky's 2015 book. It was also just a joy to read as an aging academic who remembers what it was like when people wrote engagingly and without all that kind of puff we do nowadays. So I would recommend this entirely cross-disciplinary reading. I'd love to see what people think of it.
Thanks, Emma. James?
Very briefly, thank you, everyone. Great session, and the previous one. I just want to quote Jeff Wood, as a former president of the DSA, who in the many years of agonizing over how close to get to DFID and its predecessors, used to talk about, you know, how you get away with biting the hand that feeds you. And I think we're all in different ways struggling with that, and will continue to do so. And I was actually going to, like Emma, say thank you particularly to Tadashi, because engaging with the SDGs is a good example of that. And I really liked the way, as a piece of positive science, you were critically asking ourselves, how much does economic growth have to stay in the frame in order for any discourse to have traction? But how much scope is there? And this is where you were a little bit on the fence, Tadashi, but that was probably very wise. How much do you then positively engage with the growth agenda? And I'm thinking here particularly of Jason Hickel's engagements recently, for those who've been following them on, you know, how much do you have to accept the economic growth centrality in order to criticize it if you're getting into the post-growth debate?
Thank you very much, James. We're obviously up against time now. Tobias, I'm not sure if you wanted to respond to the pandemic question. It's a big one in a way.
No, I'm just typing a comment, so that should be fine.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. It's been an extremely rich panel. I've really, really enjoyed the discussion. I don't really know, Sam, maybe you can fill us in on what's actually happening next. Is the conference literally just end now? But it's been a great conference, the bits I've participated in.
Well done. Yeah, we are free now
Okay.
for the weekend. Well, at least until ERD kicks in for some people next week. But yeah, just as a poster, thanks a lot for this these sessions. They've been great, and for forming the study group, adding to your workloads, creating more spaces for us to argue within is always welcome. So good stuff.
Great, thank you very much, and a special thanks to you, Sam, for organising this conference, I guess, for being DSA president and doing it so well, I think. I hope that we can convene some of us in some way through this group, the Politics and Political Economy group. British and I will be in touch with anyone who's on that reading list about the resources that we get each year, hopefully, what we might do with them, and anything else. We welcome your input. So thanks from all of us.